Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for coming here to the beautiful Kildare House, Macdonald-Laurier Institute's headquarters. I'm Peter Copeland, the Deputy of the Domestic Policy Program here at MLI and the co-lead of the Promised Land Project with Casey Babb. At MLI, we pride ourselves on saying what needs to be said, regardless of its popularity. And we follow, in this regard, in the footsteps of our founder, who reminds us that many are willing to speak, but few are willing to speak first. And so just days after October 7th, 2023, that fateful day, we issued an unequivocal statement in defense of Israel and launched the Promised Land Project. And this initiative, now led by myself and Casey, who's a national security expert and now I would say Canada's leading voice on anti-Semitism and Israeli security, is dedicated to combating anti-Semitism at home and abroad, as well as countering radicalization and extremism in classrooms and on our streets. And before we begin, I'd just like to contextualize the moment, because this week, the Bebas boys and their mother were buried in a single casket. Shlomo Mansour, a Holocaust survivor, returned home to Israel in one as well, after enduring more than 500 days in Hamas tunnels. So I think it's no exaggeration to say that we're witnessing the most painful moment for the Jewish world since the Holocaust. And beyond these individual tragedies, anti-Semitism has surged globally. The events of October 7th exposed just how deeply embedded this hatred has become. Since then, we've seen increasing social, ideological, and religious division, and recent data even suggest that nearly half of the world's population harbor anti-Semitic views. So today, a year and a half later since the start of the conflict, it remains somewhat in suspended animation. Throughout this period, major developments have upended long-held assumptions about Middle Eastern politics, foreign policy strategies, and even Western perceptions of Israel and its right to self-defense. With the new administration in the United States, we're seeing a disruption of the geopolitical status quo. What is clear is that conventional thinking on peace in Israel has grown stale, and the pursuit of the two-state solution has failed to produce security or stability. In light of the brutal terrorism of October 7th and Hamas's oppression of its own people, this approach seems detached from reality, and new ideas are needed. And I would say one of the reasons why these stale approaches have persisted is due to the prevalence of certain narratives and their ideological underpinnings, one of the most potent of which is in Israel's demonization is the framing of Palestinians as colonized people. Many factors, no doubt, fuel this narrative: Iranian propaganda, biased media coverage, but perhaps the most influential is post-colonial theory. Deeply tied to Marxism, this ideology reflexively labels the powerful as oppressors and the weak as victims, regardless of historical or moral context. It has fueled the rewriting of Western history, attacks on national identity, and educational curricula designed to undermine confidence in Western civilization, and it is being used against Israel now. So our discussion today will explore these themes and more. We're honored to welcome David Hirsh, a renowned scholar, expert on anti-Semitism, and head of the London Centre of Contemporary Anti-Semitism. David will sit down with our own Casey Babb for a conversation covering contemporary anti-Semitism, populism, the BDS movement, and the ongoing aftermath of October 7th. David has pioneered a sociological analysis of contemporary anti-Zionism and its intersection with anti-Semitism. He's studied crimes against humanity, totalitarianism, democracy, and populism, and he teaches sociology, criminology, and human rights at both undergraduate and graduate levels. And he was instrumental in building the Engage network, which led the fight against academic boycotts of Israel and anti-Semitic politics in Britain. So without further ado, please welcome David Hirsh in conversation with Casey Babb. David, over to you for some opening remarks.
Oh, okay. Opening remarks. Unless you'd just like to dive right in with me, David.
Yeah, let's.
Well, we have plenty to talk about.
I mean, I could speak for, once I get going, I can speak for a couple of hours, but don't let me.
Well, we can just jump right in. I mean, it's great to see everybody here. Full house for David Hirsh. No surprise there. David, I mean, there's so much going on. Where to start? As Peter alluded to in his opening remarks there, just in the last few days alone, in the last week, there's been these catastrophic instances of cruelty, of inhumane behavior, of extremism, of terrorism. And I think there's a part of me that, and you might be like this a little bit too, where at some point in time you thought, well, this is nothing new. We're used to this, at least in the Western world, seeing acts of terrorism, seeing all of these sort of hostile activities. But then there's also something right now that feels different for me, and I'm wondering if what we're living through right now feels different to you, and if so, what is it? I mean, what is this just another chapter of anti-Semitism in the 21st century?
I think the question is really well put, actually, because I think on October the 7th and in the aftermath of October the 7th, until today, actually, people almost without really thinking about it portrayed the events in the aftermath of October the 7th as being something that changed everything, that changed the world, a kind of herald of a new world. And I remember at the time, I could well understand why people felt like that, and I felt a bit like that. But I remember trying to think through what was completely new and unique and different about this than compared to other things in the history, in particular, of Israel. So, for example, in 1948, the Arab League, armed by the British Empire, sent 5 armies and tanks and armies to wipe out Israel. And in 1967 and 1973, the Arab League sent planes and tanks and armies and planes, air cover to wipe out Israel again. And actually, we always said that if Israel is defeated in that way, it would create a real danger for the people of Israel, for the Jews of the Middle East. And compared to those 3 huge threats, 3 huge events, an incursion on a particular day with Toyota pickup trucks is not necessarily completely different and worse. And then if you say, well, it was the focus of the terrorism itself, I mean, also we remember when I was growing up, the attack on the Munich Olympics. I mean, stunning. Because of its symbolism being in Munich in 1972, like a few years after the Holocaust, and the murder of athletes, or we could talk about the kind of relentless air hijackings and Tebbe. So what was new and unique about the 7th of October? Now, there were some interesting things about 7th of October, one of which was that since 1967 anyway, Israelis had not felt the kind of insecurity that they felt that day. That day, literally, Israelis were calling for help. I mean, literally on the phone, calling for help from the police, from the army, and there was no help. And the sociologist Danny Trom in Paris, he says this brought them straight back to a much more diaspora experience of being Jewish. And at the same time, in the diaspora, Jews were kind of corralled into a much more Israeli experience of being Jewish by being expected either to condemn Israel or to stand in the dock for Israel. So, it was a huge event, and things changed. But I don't think it was a sort of utterly new thing going on. And actually, I don't know, I hated the whole Hamas game show that they've been putting on for the last, you know, when they broadcast on the TV and they say, oh, find out on Saturday whether we've killed them or whether we're going to let them free. And then and I have really tried my best to refuse to engage with it. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people kind of go, oh gosh, I hope they're all right, or I hope this, or... And it's left me cold, and I've kind of thought, I'm not playing. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So in a way, to be honest, we knew that the Bibas children were dead a long time ago, mm-hmm. or we were pretty sure. Mm-hmm. And so I really have resisted playing that game,
Yeah.
But having said that, lots of people haven't resisted
of course.
it, and it is a remarkably,
of course.
It's an awful sight, right, to watch. The coffin's on the stage, and the stage is dressed up with classic anti-Semitic iconography. Yeah. Somebody on Twitter, I think, said, it's like, this is really Hamas anti-Semitism. And I said, not really. It looks like they've studied at SOAS or at Goldsmiths and produced, produced a stage set for the occasion. And actually, you think I'm joking, but David Miller, the professor of sociology from Bristol University, was tweeting from Beirut at Nasrallah's funeral.
It's unbelievable.
Yeah. And he, I'm stuck in traffic and it's so wonderful.
Yeah.
And there were voices, Western voices from from Beirut at the funeral of one of the biggest genocidal Jew killers of his generation, saying, this is so wonderful.
Well, this is I don't want to say a great segue. It's a dark segue to something else that I wanted to talk with you about, and you've written about, obviously, at length, is the evolution of anti-Semitism on the left. In your 2017 book, Contemporary Left Anti-Semitism, you cover this gradual, I guess, mainstreaming of anti-Semitism, I think, from the 70s or 80s up until the present day, or at least, up until 8 or 9 years ago. I've been quite taken aback by the voices that have become quite vocal since October 7th from the left in a very hostile way. Are you surprised by the anti-Semitism that you're seeing from the left since October 7th? Or is it really, again, just sort of more of the same?
So firstly, when one talks about left anti-Semitism today, a lot of people, especially left people, are just kind of shocked and bewildered, and they sort of say, no, how can the left be anti-Semitic? And that is just straightforwardly ignorant, right? The left does not teach its children its own history. So left anti-Semitism goes back a very long way. Yeah. It's not by any means to say that all anti-Semitism is left anti-Semitism. There are all kinds of other anti-Semitisms. There was Christian anti-Semitism and right-wing and fascistic and nationalist and anti-nationalist anti-Semitism, but left anti-Semitism is very old. And, all through the 19th century, especially in Germany, there were questions raging about the so-called Jewish question. Mm-hmm. And those debates were mainly on a kind of left liberal space. And the debates were about what is wrong with the Jews that they cannot emancipate like everybody else. And there's the famous debate between Bruno Bauer and Karl Marx, where Bauer is saying that the Jews have to emancipate themselves first from their backward religion, and then they can join with the rest of humanity in fighting for full human emancipation. And actually, Marx is exactly on the right side of that debate, and he says, no, nonsense. He says that emancipation is about emancipating the state from its Christian particularity,
right.
And the state must become democratic, not the Jews.
Right.
So anyway, I could talk at length, but there is an absolutely authentic history of left anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
And then you have the Stalinist and communist versions, in 1952, 7 years after the creation of Czechoslovakia, the whole of the leadership of Czech communism is hanged, having been found guilty of bourgeois Jewish nationalism and Zionism. Yeah. And then in the 60s and the 70s, this anti-Zionism is really developed in Moscow, in the Soviet Union, by explicitly anti-Semitic people and forces for explicit reasons. And interestingly, the anti-Zionism that they created was absolutely recognizable with the anti-Zionists today.
Yeah.
So firstly, when people just look mystified, how can the left be anti-Semitic?
Right.
They're just ignorant, right? And if you say to them, not only is there a history of left anti-Semitism, but your specific anti-Zionism, including the tropes about apartheid and about colonialism and about genocide, were all constructed by the KGB in the offices of state security in Moscow in the late 60s.
Yeah.
They just look at you like you're mad.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, firstly, it's not a surprise in that sense. Secondly, I would say I think I did, and I think most people did expect anti-Semitism, or they understood anti-Semitism to be really a thing of the past in the late 20th century.
Yeah.
So after the experience of the Holocaust, anti-Semitism seemed to be gone, dead, really.
Yeah.
It might be that I was not as alive as I should have been to Islamist anti-Semitism.
Right.
And I understood that there was far-right anti-Semitism, especially in Eastern Europe, for example, but I thought of that as something that would kind of fade away. So anti-Semitism came back in the 21st century.
Early 2000s.
In 2001, you had the end of the peace process, so a transformation of Israel as something that most people thought would just do the deal and find a way to live in peace with their neighbors, and everybody was having fantasies about high-speed rail networks from Cairo to Beirut via Tel Aviv, and that idea that Israel was a unique evil in the world was not gone. The idea that had been legitimized by the UN in the mid-70s, it wasn't gone, but it was not mainstream.
Right.
And that idea was brought back quite consciously, especially into the Durban conference, the World Conference Against Racism in August 2001. So you have the final collapse of the peace process at the beginning of 2001. You have Durban at the August 2001, a huge governmental and NGO and youth and student conference, huge, in the New South Africa, where there was a formidable campaign to construct Zionism as the new key symbolic racism after the fall of apartheid. And then the week following that, you had 9/11 in September 2001, which you can see as being kind of symbolic of an Islamist jihadi anti-Semitism. So it comes back. And then out of Durban, this insistence that Israel is like South Africa, out of that comes the boycott movement, and out of that comes a kind of willingness in the NGO world, in the UN world, in the human rights law world, and in the left more generally, a kind of campaign to reconstruct Israel, not as a state which needs to make peace, but as a unique entity which is not a state, which is not legitimate, which needs to be destroyed in order for there to be peace.
Right. David, can you talk, you bring up Durban, and I recently sat down with Erwin Kotler, and he brought up Durban. But typically when I'm talking with people and I'm having conversations about these sorts of things, Durban does not come up, and it should. Could you, not to put you on the spot, but could you give sort of a snapshot to people in here of what happened at Durban and the significance?
So I would love to write a book about Durban.
Right.
In fact, I've kind of started doing interviews, but I do not have time to do anything at the moment. The reason, when I really came into this world of anti-Semitism we were fighting the people who wanted to ban Jewish societies back in the mid-'80s in student politics. But I got into this world as an academic in about 2004.
Right.
In response to the proposal to boycott our Israeli colleagues. And I started going to some international meetings and international events, and there were certain kind of characters, people who were always there, and I got to know them. And it was a little while until I suddenly realized that all of these guys had been at Durban. Right. The people who were running this work all over the world were Jews who had been at Durban.
Right.
And they went to Durban not as Jews, not as representatives of the institutions of the Jewish community. They went to Durban not to fight anti-Semitism, but they went there because they were anti-racists. And it was a world conference against racism. And so the shock of finding that they were not allowed to be at home in that world, which was their world anymore, was the shock. They felt themselves to be part of the world anti-racist movement, and what they found was a formidable campaign to construct Israel as a unique evil and to boycott and isolate evil and to evil Israel. And swirling with that was a whole load of anti-Semitism and explicit stuff. The protocols were being sold. One of the pre-conference meets had been in Iran, at Tehran, and the Jews were not given visas until the day of the thing or something like that. So two of those people that I mentioned, the people who I never realized had been at Durban, were Suzette Bronkhorst and, oh my gosh, my brain goes with names. Anyway, her partner, and they were lovely, lovely people, and they were always outside smoking. And unfortunately, they are both dead now.
Oh my God.
But I asked Suzette once, I said, explain to me what the big deal about Durban was. Because, look, we've all been involved in nasty debates about Israel.
Yeah.
And they're nasty, and we don't like them. But what was it about Durban that changed people's lives, right, who were there? And Suzette said, Ronald Isons was her partner, Sorry, Ronald. Suzette said to me, I refuse to allow Durban to define my political life in the way that Auschwitz defined my father's political life. And I looked at her and I thought, are you mad? Like, what are you talking about?
Right.
How can you mention Durban in the same breath as Auschwitz?
Right.
What are you talking about? And if you like, the research project of the book that I want to write is to answer that question.
Wow.
How was Suzette able to say that? And I think what it was there was a casting out of people who felt that they were at home. And I think that's almost a universal experience of this kind of anti-Semitism anyway, and it's one that resonated with me. I remember very well being at Goldsmiths Sociology, right? They thought they were really cool. It was a big sociology department. Yeah. I remember sitting in rooms like this thinking, wow, I'm one of these people now.
Yeah.
And then I raised a few arguments against the boycott of Israel and against anti-Semitism, and very suddenly I was no longer one of these people.
Right.
And it's England, so then no one said anything.
Right,
I was just frozen out, right?
Right.
That was the end of me. I was transformed from one of these people, from a sociologist in the cool sociology department, into a Zionist sociologist.
Right, and not by choice, of course.
I never said I was a Zionist,
right.
But I was defined as being a Zionist by everybody and treated as such. So sometimes people say, well, what is a Zionist? I don't know what a Zionist is. And I kind of quite often stubbornly refuse to answer that question because the important answer to that question is what is the meaning of the word Zionist that they constructed me as.
Right.
And what it means is a person who embraces apartheid and racism and in our day-to-day genocide.
Yeah. And without consulting you, without your consent.
There's no self-identification here.
No.
And so it's true that it's possible for Jews to get exceptional status to avoid anti-Semitism.
Right.
But to get exceptional status, you have to disavow Israel, and not in your own terms, right? I could stand up and say, look, I've supported the peace movement for 40 years now, and I've done this and that, but my own terms would not be good enough, because the only terms that would do would be to stipulate that Israel is committing genocide, and that anyone who raises the issue of anti-Semitism in relation to anti-Zionism is doing so in bad faith in order to try to silence and delegitimize criticism of Israel.
Absolutely.
So if you want to be an exceptional Jew, if you want to carry on being one of the boys in a sociology department, then that's what you have to do. And not only do you have to do it once, but you have to keep doing it.
How have you walked that line, though? And I think you've probably been asked this question before, because it's, you talk about the boycott and you sort of raising objections to these things in 2004, 2005, 6. And here we are 20 years later. And you haven't been, you like completely isolated, to the best of my knowledge. Like, how do you still walk that line between being a scholar, but also being David Hirsh, the expert on these issues?
Well, I have been pretty isolated, actually, for most of that time. I found a kind of way to coexist and to keep my job.
Right.
Which was that I would look after the shop while everybody was off doing their interesting work and their research and their travel. And I did a lot of work teaching first-year students.
Right.
And also a lot of work doing pastoral care, like as a senior tutor. And actually, I quite enjoyed both of those jobs. I really enjoyed doing introductory first-year teaching because students come to Goldsmiths and they are first taught Marx and Weber and Durkheim by me. And later on, when they are told that I'm the devil, they kind of go, well, we know him.
Yeah.
Hang on. So I'm really comfortable with that. And I quite enjoy teaching that stuff in a way that it should be taught, and hopefully to inoculate them a little bit against what they will be told later.
Right.
But my research was not valued in any sense. It was not financed. It was not valued. It was not encouraged.
Right.
And I then kind of did that in my own time, and they kind of ignored me.
Right.
So that's how it worked.
Right.
And it's difficult. And of course it gets in, this is part of what we're up to now with the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism, is we are reconstructing communities of scholarship, which is what a university is supposed to be, right? Scholarship is not something you can do on your own. It is something you do in communities of, and disciplines, communities of scholars. And with that comes infrastructure, right? So in order to do well as an academic, you need communities, and you need places where you can publish, and you need research funding so that you get time to go and do your work, and you need to be in a career structure where you can earn a living, and you need to be able to teach. And those are the things that we are, by and large, to a large degree, frozen out of. So that's what we're trying to address with the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism. And it's quite interesting because everybody who knows anything about antisemitism at the moment knows that the campuses are, well, somebody the other day in an event said the campuses are on fire, right? And I think actually he said there are fires all over the campuses, not the campuses on fire. There are fires, and we need to work out where the fires can be fought and how they can be fought. And I came back and I said, he had funders in the room actually, so I thought I'd help him out here. And I said, what we see are a lot of organizations who can see that there's a problem of antisemitism on campus. They're chucking water over the wall into the campus and hoping to put out the fires. And I said, no, give me and Eyal Feinberg at Graz, give us your buckets of water, and we'll take them into the universities, and we will try to put those buckets of water where the fire is.
Right.
Because whatever you do with students, when they go back to campus and they go into the lecture theatre and they are taught by people who push anti-Semitic frameworks and anti-Semitic politics, and the books on the reading list are anti-Semitic, and the coursework is marked in an anti-Semitic way, whatever you do for students outside of that is kind of not all that impactful.
Right.
So we need to be inside the disciplines, and not many people are, because not many people have been able to.
You're in a way, you're talking about something that I've been thinking about quite a bit since October 7th. So typically when I'm speaking with people about October 7th and what's happened since, they talk about at least two things in two distinct ways. The military the wars, the physical kinetic wars happening in the Middle East, and then the anti-Semitic fallout elsewhere, as if they are sort of two separate, distinct things. And something that I've been thinking about more and more lately, and I saw a headline yesterday or the day prior that the IDF they misread Hamas for years. And then I was thinking, well, what have we misread here for years to get to this point? I mean, and I don't have a clear answer yet. I mean, is this something that you've thought about where, because there's a part of me, David, where I say, why isn't everybody screaming about all of this? Why isn't this a bigger deal to people? It's like, why are there, we might have a rally on Parliament Hill or a counter protest, and there might be 500 people or 1,000 people. Why aren't there 500,000 people?
Yeah. So, to begin with the point about Israel having misread the situation, it's astonishing to me that the government of Israel allowed Israel to be invaded in that way. The government had always, people kind of knew Netanyahu was a crook in this way or that way, or they didn't like him, or he was vulgar, but he will look after us, but he will make
that
sure
was always his
there
big
is security.
Thing. Yeah.
And honestly, I don't know why he did not resign I kind of know why he didn't resign, but he ought to have resigned on the 7th of October because he is responsible for the state. And you needed 5 tanks or 5 helicopters on the Gaza border to prevent the incursion. And there should have been a proper inquiry and all of that. So there are difficult and complex explanations for how that happened. Everyone has their favorite explanation,
of course,
according to their politics.
Yeah.
So the left says that Ben Gvir had all the troops out in the West Bank doing his stuff, and the right says that the left was too focused on constitutional issues and the democracy movement to notice the external enemy. The polarization in Israel was really frightening to me, and it went away for a few months and came back.
that's right.
Came back worse, so that now lots of people on the Israeli left are sort of saying, well, Netanyahu could get the hostages back if he wanted to,
Right.
which, as far as I can see, is kind of utter nonsense.
Right.
So that was just the setup for your question, really.
Yeah.
But I think it's necessary to say that, actually.
Yeah, of course.
I think the big, strong, tough guy who said, at least you can trust me on security, and he's had his military victories since, and he sort of milks those.
Yeah.
But anyway, so what have we missed? I think the what you said was interesting. When you're talking about Israel, right? Israel exists in the way that it exists because of anti-Semitism.
Right.
I think. Now, certain kind of Israeli nationalists or kind of Zionists kind of hate that because they say, no, Israel is the authentic home of the Jewish people and blah, blah, blah. But historically, Israel was set up in 1948. And it was set up in the aftermath of the Holocaust. And Zionism was largely a utopian movement before 1933.
Right.
Utopian meaning it wasn't really going to happen.
Right.
People moved to Israel, yes, and of course Jews had always been in Israel, yes, but people don't move en masse until they are terrified.
Right.
And the old joke at that time was, what's the definition of a Zionist? A Zionist is one Jew who gives money to a second Jew so that a third Jew can move to Israel.
Right.
And what changed everything was first the Holocaust and then the War of 1948.
Yeah.
And by the way, anti-Zionism with its big macho historical materialism just tells the story in terms of ideas, right? Israel is genocidal. Why? Because the idea in Herzl's head in the 1890s was genocidal. It's like the kind of pure idealism that these guys say that they hate. And this happens a lot, right?
Yeah.
The theorists of anti-Zionism and the theorists of that kind of left, they forget all of the methodological things that they themselves stand up for. And that's one of them. So there was a material change in Jewish life in the middle of the 20th century, right? Jews today do not live in the places where they lived 100 years ago. Jews today, half of them live in North America and half of them live in Israel. And that's it. Like, there's a few in Britain and France and South Africa and Australia, but basically, North America and Israel. And 100 years ago, nearly none of them lived in North America and Israel.
I think there was an article recently in the CBC or somewhere, they were interviewing one of the 7 remaining Jews in Syria.
Yes.
What is this? You know.
Yes, and there was the same in Iraq. I think the last one died. Anyway.
Yeah.
So, and of course, everybody talks about the Holocaust, but you're right to remind me, and I shouldn't need reminding, that the Jews lived across the Middle East. And actually, blasphemously, like, colonialism was not good for the Jews. It was not good for anyone, and it was not good for the Jews. But it created a Middle East where actually some kind of cosmopolitan settlement was possible, where Jews and other minorities lived in the cities across the Middle East. And the force that generally defeats colonialism is generally nationalism. And the nationalism that defeated colonialism in the Middle East was generally a rather ethnically focused Arab nationalism, a nationalism that named itself an Arab nationalism, and when it got state power, named those states as Arab states. And Jews were pushed out of them. Life was made impossible across the Middle East to one extent or another in different places, and then later in 1979 also in Iran, and the Jews of the Middle East went to Israel. And that is a fact that is really denied. We talk about denial of 7th of October and Holocaust denial. That is another denial of, people say, well, it was Zionism, or the Zionists acted as, what's the word? Agent provocateur in Baghdad. No, the Jews were pushed out of the great cities of the Middle East. And most of them went to Israel. And that's why, by the way, British left, Canadian left, US left. That's why about half of the Jews in Israel could not pass as white in any circumstances. So, point being that anti-Semitism was intimately linked to the creation of Israel in the way that it was created and at the time it was created. And so when we talk about boycott movements, for example, the easiest way politically to make a case against the boycott is to talk about the effects. If you have an organization which gets taken over by a boycott campaign, that boycott campaign has to create an emotional response to Israel, which makes people want to boycott it. Now, we don't, in university spaces or in left liberal spaces, we don't boycott anyone else. We don't boycott Russians or Chinese people or even Americans. You might think I'm being funny, right? I came out of a class the other day and went in the elevator, and two students said to me, we really hate Americans.
Oh my God.
And I said, what do you mean? What do you mean? This is a sociology class. How can you? We really hate it. Just that voice, just that accent makes me shiver, she said. And I was so struck by that. And when I teach about, literally genocide in China, no one gets in the lift and says, I really hate Chinese people. No one. It's unthinkable. Anyway, that's another story which I can go into. But, so the easiest way to make the case against BDS is effects. That it creates anti-Semitism in any space where that campaign takes root. And it's not even a philosophical argument. It's not a kind of definitional claim. It's just an empirical claim.
Right.
You can tell because you can look and see that anti-Semitism results in all kinds of ways in any organization that gets taken over by a boycott campaign. So that's the easiest way to make the case, is about anti-Semitic effects. And the hardest way is to say the boycott campaign is in fact, in some sense, inspired by, caused by anti-Semitism.
Right.
Because people hate that, right? Yeah. If you say the boycott really is is anti-Semitic in its conception, people get cross. They don't like being called anti-Semitic. But the politics of boycott is certainly, it's really difficult to explain the focus on Israel without, in the end, having some kind of first cause in terms of anti-Semitism.
Right.
So sorry, just to make...
No.
You can talk about, the world is divided into two, into the good and the bad, the imperialist and the anti-imperialist, the white and the black, the north and the south. You can divide the world into two, and you get the kind of current politics. But there's another step necessary to make Israel symbolic of that imperialism or modernity or capitalism or whatever you want to call it. Another step necessary to say that Israel is the key symbol of that.
Right.
And I don't see how you can really explain that without reference to anti-Semitism.
Right.
So anyway, the answer to your question is that Israel and responses to it and the causes of it is all bound up with anti-Semitism.
Right.
And the current conflict is bound up with anti-Semitism. And the Iranian campaign through Syria and through Lebanon and through Afghanistan and through Iraq focuses on the evils of Israel in a particular way. And there was another point, but I've forgotten it.
No, that's great. Well, you brought up boycotts, and so we were going to talk about that a little bit later. But now that you've raised it, several years ago, you said something that really struck a chord with me. And you said boycotting Jews has such a long history. You think of the Holocaust as this huge thing with millions herded around, but in the beginning, it was very intimate. Small towns, a few families, a few boycotts of local businesses, and then it all just spiraled. And I thought that was just a powerful way to situate the history of boycotts. Things, at least to me, seem to be spiraling a little bit now in terms of these boycott movements. And that's, at MLI, this is something that we're becoming increasingly interested in addressing. Can you give us your take on like the current state of just generally these boycott campaigns? Because it seems to come in waves, at least to me. What's your impression of this right now?
Well, you might be right, but my impression is actually, and I've got no evidence for this really, my impression is that the boycott campaign itself has become less important in this sense. The only game in town at the moment is genocide.
Right.
Israel is guilty of genocide. And I suppose it follows naturally that it should be boycotted.
Right.
Right? But people are not that bothered about talking about boycott because the only thing they want to talk about is genocide. In other words, and this also goes back a long way, I'm very proud to be English, the place which is the birth of the blood libel,
Right.
where Jews were first accused of murdering non-Jewish children as a way of reenacting the murder of God.
Right.
And today it is completely legitimate and good manners to claim that the Israeli state is, in an organized and deliberate way, murdering thousands of children. And actually, the one trope you see a lot, and I saw this, 15 years ago from Tariq Ali, if anybody remembers him.
Yeah.
The story that the bodies of Palestinian children are brought into the morgue with bullets dead center in the middle of their forehead, and that is evidence that Israeli snipers are deliberately murdering children. And I've heard this for a long time, and I heard it recently. I think it was a British doctor who had been working in Gaza for Hamas, under Hamas sovereignty. And he repeated this story. And it sounds unanswerable, right? If a doctor says, we saw bodies coming into the morgue which were obviously the results of deliberate Israeli murders, and we saw it routinely, what are we supposed to say? How is anyone supposed to say, no, that doctor is a big big liar.
Right.
So this story, although it's incoherent, because most of the story is not that children are targeted, but that there's this kind of mass campaign to wipe out the people who live in Gaza. So that's the game. That the game is to accuse Israel of murdering children and, incidentally, other civilians. And it's a blood libel claim, and also it's a Holocaust inversion claim, right?
Yeah.
Israel is now doing what the Nazis did to the Israelis, to the Jews. And, of course, the designation of Jews as Nazis has a particular. I mean, nobody says, "Oh, Israel is just like the Pol Pot regime," right? Or just like the Serbs in Srebrenica. No, it's Nazis, and for a reason, because Nazis became a kind of symbol of evil. Interestingly, actually, 20th century, and one of the results of that, we all probably, I'm looking around, we're all old here nearly, and we grew up with watching films, war films, and the Nazis were just these kind of inhuman, monstrous simulacra of human beings, right? Sort of strutting around.
And this is still the case.
So the truth about Nazism is it was attractive to radical people. Martin Heidegger, right, one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century, was all excited about Nazism and joined the Nazi party and ran the University of Heidelberg for Hitler for a year. And his girlfriend, who was also his grad student, Hannah Arendt, had to run away because she was Jewish. They had their Hugo Boss uniforms. They were stylish. They were exciting. They were anti-establishment. They had a critique of bourgeois hypocrisy. So actually that plastic understanding of Nazism as being something just monstrous and ridiculous does not help anybody. And it also doesn't help to recognize contemporary anti-Semitism because it's not like that. In fact, contemporary anti-Semitism is embraced on our campuses by the good people, by the people who feel themselves to be good and who feel themselves to be the best opponents of anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
And actually more and more they are saying that it's the Zionists who are anti-Semitic. As well as everything else. So I can't remember where we were now.
No, but that's great. We're talking about boycotts, and right now it seems like perhaps it's not the flavor of the day. It's not boycotts right now. It's genocide.
I think it just follows. Right? I'm not saying it's not a threat.
No. Yeah.
People will want to boycott Israel,
of course.
It's kind of
Yeah. You brought up a couple more questions for you, David, and then we'll open it up to the floor. You brought up nationalism, but I also wanted to get your thoughts on populism. And in the book you edited, The Rebirth of Antisemitism in the 21st Century, from the academic boycott campaign into the mainstream, which I would encourage people to read. It's phenomenal. You and your co-authors discuss populist politics and the significance of anti-Semitism on both the left and the right. And you wrote that each, the left and the right, sought to focus popular anger against a liberal metropolitan establishment, which was accused of being connected more intimately to a global system of elites than their own people. Have you been thinking about anti-Semitism and populism and where we're headed right now? Because there are certain leaders right now where it's a volatile time.
So in Britain, people used to say to me, why do you spend all your time fighting the boycotters? They're just ridiculous, and do something more interesting. And we always said if we don't defeat them here in the academic unions, they will spread. And indeed they spread, but they spread in the end much quicker than we thought they would. And I think the reason is because there was this kind of populist, I don't really want to call it a moment because it's still going on, but there was a populist moment in Britain with the Scotland referendum, that the Scottish nationalists were saying, there is this London elite, political class, people who don't know anything about Scotland, who don't care about the real country, who are implicated in finance capital and globalism, and we should get our own independence. And they were very close to winning the election, the referendum, actually. Interestingly, in Scotland, when they failed to win the referendum, but the Scottish nationalists won in the parliament, they then shifted in these terms into a kind of representation for Scotland in Westminster. And there was quite a much more kind of rational response, was this big block of votes at Westminster that could go and do good things for Scotland, instead of smashing it all up and starting again. The following year was Corbyn. Corbyn was suddenly elected to Labour leader in 2015, and Corbyn came out of nowhere. Labour had been defeated in a general election again, and a lot of Labour people were kind of saying, oh, we'll never win a general election, so we might as well have somebody we love, or somebody who will tell it to the man, stick it to the man, than another boring old fart like Ed Miliband, whatever his name was, no one can really remember. And these guys, the kind of, what were they called, the campaign group, the left group of MPs, they would take it in turns to stand for leader, and it was Corbyn's turn. And Corbyn, they put Corbyn up, and suddenly Corbyn started getting votes, and he was terrified. He went AWOL for a few days during the campaign, because yes, when he realised that he might win. And we were saying at the time, we were issuing blog posts and being as loud as we can about Corbyn's politics. Corbyn embraces an anti-Semitic view of the world, which really comes from a kind of old-fashioned Morning Star communist provenance. And we put out kind of lists of 20 things that Corbyn has said and done which are anti-Semitic, and no one was interested. People just said, we know what you're up to, which is, the old Livingston formulation. You're just saying that in order to prevent a proper criticism of Israel, to prevent someone who cares about the Palestinians from coming to power. Anyway, 2015 was Corbyn, 2016 was Brexit, right, which was very much a kind of furious campaign against a campaign in the name of the people, against this sort of North London, finance capital, globalist, Davos elite. Now, anyone who knows anything about anti-Semitism knows that way of talking about a liberal elite is very close to anti-Semitism. Now, in the Brexit debate, it didn't really become anti-Semitic at all. And I think the reason for that is simple, is that they were quite happy to be in opposition to Corbyn, who they could denounce as anti-Semitic. And that was fine. But that politics is a market for anti-Semitism. And I mean, honestly, I did not think that Elon Musk was doing a Nazi salute the other day. I just thought it was so ridiculous and so bizarre that it could not have really been true, although it looked like one. And then a week later, I saw Steve Bannon doing it, and Steve Bannon knows what he's doing. And Daniel Finkelstein, actually a columnist in the Times, wrote that now we're going to see the MAGA people doing the Nazi salute to show how tough they are, to show that they can. And then they can ridicule anyone who says, oh, you're a Nazi, and then they can say, oh, you've got Trump derangement syndrome. So they're going to start doing it, and Finkelstein anyway said that it won't be too long till Trump does it himself. And then the crowds start doing it. And you might still say it's a kind of postmodern farce, right? That they're not Nazis, but they're doing this Nazi salute in order to show their power, and because it's more important to them to make the liberal elites feel crap than it is to make themselves feel good. There are all kinds of ways of telling. But fundamentally, right, the liberal democratic state is a complicated beast, and human beings are complicated, and they are diverse, and everyone has whole intersections of different interests. And our interests are represented in the state through parliament, through the courts, through civil society, through, in all sorts of different and complex ways. And in the end, however imperfectly, the diversity of human beings are represented in the state. Populism rejects that because populism says that the state is fake.
Yeah.
The state is the property of this cosmopolitan, global, blah, 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 elite. And the state is fake, and the real power lies somewhere in the darkness, and the people are fooled into believing that there is a nice democratic state.
Yeah.
And so from an actual diversity of men and women is created a singular, the people. And the people is fooled, and the people must be strong and liberate itself in its authenticity. And in order to do that, it has to have a one single voice. And that's why populism is nearly always represented by an authoritarian male voice. And I would say that populism has something in common with 20th century totalitarianism. It's interesting because there are these rules, right? One of the rules is you're not allowed to compare anything to the Holocaust. Right? Nothing. You're not allowed to say anything is like the Nazis. But actually, if nothing was like the Nazis, if the Nazis were these plastic, inhuman caricatures, there would be no threat. And how on earth did they come to power? Did they come from space? Well, some people think that. But so, Trump is not Hitler, right? Trump is not a Nazi, but there are similarities between that kind of populism and the roots of 20th century totalitarianism. I think that's true. And just to make the point that firstly, the polling shows very clearly that people who are most likely to be anti-Semitic, be both on the left or the right. We were trying to answer a question, is there more threat from the left or from the right? And it's a question that I hate anyway, because I think in politics, the threat of anti-Semitism is most serious when it's close to you. It's most serious in your own political environment, in your own political family. Not in the people that you hate anyway, but when it's around you. We did the polling, and the polling showed something interesting. It wasn't the right or the left that was more anti-Semitic. It was people who embrace an idea that behind the state lies the real power.
Yeah.
And also, the other thing it correlated with was that anti-Semitism correlates with people who are willing to consider very harsh measures against their political opponent.
Right.
And it follows, right, that if your political opponents are a dark and utterly malevolent conspiracy, then you should consider some really quite serious measures against them.
Yeah.
So, and there are all sorts of reasons why those kinds of politics are open markets for anti-Semitism. And as I say, there are reasons, also in America, I don't think the Trump movement has particularly bought the anti-Semitism, but it might. And people used to say to me, what is the real danger of Corbyn? And I think it's that. I think Corbyn just brought into the mainstream anti-Semitic politics. Yeah. I don't think, Corbyn wasn't going to ship us off to Scotland and kill us or anything like that. Although some Jews decided that he was. Right. And I felt a bit guilty about that because I was the one that told them Corbyn was anti-Semitic. And then the Jews are coming to me and going, well, is it time to leave? Is it time? And I'm going, no, it's not time to leave.
Right.
But being asked that question is quite serious already.
David, one last question for you, and I don't want to get too personal, but I ask everybody who we bring in, Ann Atwell, if I asked her the same thing.
Are you going to ask me out?
I'm curious, this is heavy stuff. It's intense, it's dark, it's social media, even writing about it, talking about it. It's not, and you've talked about this before, how you didn't set out at the beginning of your career to be, this was almost forced upon you. I think I read or heard you on a podcast, or you either wrote it and you said something along the lines of, I just wanted to be like your sort of typical sociologist and study some of these lighter things, interesting scholarly things. I wanted to ask how you're doing, because I don't think we're asking each other that enough, especially since October 7th. And then we'll open it up.
So look, my instinct is to say, I'm fine, right? I'm tough. This is my job. It's the job that I took on. I'm all right. I mean, I'm not very good at knowing how I'm doing, actually, and I'm not very good at knowing what the other me would have been if I'd ignored
Right.
the anti-Semitism that I saw around me in 2004. It's impossible to tell.
Yeah.
And I think you're right that it is very tough. And being made homeless, being cast out, being cast as someone who is not a real sociologist, but someone who is studying anti-Semitism in the hope of delegitimizing criticism of Israel. Or Howard Jacobson said, you know, he's not a real novelist, he's a propagandist for Israel. And Luciana Berger said she was never a Labour MP, she was a Jewish MP. And none of us wanted that. But we are constructed against our choosing and against our will as Zionists, meaning murderers. And then what are we going to do? We can stay quiet. And actually staying quiet is not a bad idea, right? If you've got kids going to college, keep out of politics, you know, play football. But actually, at some point at my college, the rugby team started putting BDS patches on the uniform. Yeah, on the so that even if you literally kept out and wanted to play rugby, and rugby was always in England the most sort of reactionary beer boy thing where you wouldn't come across radical politics. Suddenly you come across it, and you had then either to wear the patch or to make an argument. So and actually that's one of the things that did happen after 7th of October, is that more and more people got cast out of the place where they thought they were at home.
Right.
And that includes, I mean, it happened to us ages ago. So somebody came to me in 2016 and said, I joined the Labour Party because I really liked Corbyn and I thought he'd house the homeless and blah, blah, blah. And she said, but now, 2018, 2 years later, I realised that he's anti-Semitic, and I realised that the Labour Party has become completely inhospitable space. And my instinct was to go, well, you're an idiot then, because we told you, right? That was an unhealthy instinct.
Yeah.
because everyone goes through this journey of being in a space where they thought they were at home, like somebody I met whose daddy was a Czech fighter pilot who went back to the war, to Czechoslovakia after the war in 1945 to join socialism.
Wow.
And within 7 years was put into the uranium mine at the time that Slansky was hanged, and he came out 11 years later with lung cancer. Now, you know, thank goodness the people who run sociology and the Labour Party do not have uranium mines.
Right.
They do not have state power. And in fact, I think that's quite a significant point to finish this question on, is that one of the things is this, is that in my experience, certainly recently, the left is very, very crap, right? And just as frightening as the prospect of the left winning is the prospect of the left being completely smashed and obliterated. And if we talk about the broad liberal left being smashed and obliterated, this is really frightening for example, for Muslims, for Jews, for various other kinds of minorities, and for the democratic state. And so the poor health of left liberal politics has more possible bad outcomes than simply them winning. Because them losing, which is what they tend to do, could be just as bad.
Yeah. Thank you for that, David. I'd like to open it up for some questions. We've got about 20 minutes left. Do you want to pass around?
Thank you. Let me say that it's well, I'm very happy to be here, and it's a fascinating conversation. And it usually happens that don't tell anybody. It's not recorded. Most of the seminars I attend, I'm the Polish ambassador Witold Dzielski. Most seminars I attend, it's 25% of a seminar I spend on my telephone working, 25% I pretend I listen, and 50% I do listen just to see what is happening. And down here, it was fascinating. I mean, I obviously agree with most of the things that you have said, and I'll come back after this seminar with quite a bit of thinking. So thank you. That's the first point. Second, being the Polish ambassador, let me just state the obvious that Poland is a depository of the Jewish history, and we are proud of that. We've been in this regard we are a great supporter of the Jewish community. Just recently we had the 80th anniversary of the liberation of the German Nazi Auschwitz concentration and extermination camp. We have, in Poland, we continue to build museums. Just a new museum is being built right now related to the ghetto uprising, and so we are, very much engaged. So that's, but that goes without saying. The question of anti-Semitism. This is and how to tackle this topic today. This is a topic I would be able to spend with myself talking for a couple of hours non-stop. I have in this regard. I have a question on Israel and your thoughts on the recent UN votes. The Western community, so to speak, was very, I don't know what is the term, upset or worried to see Americans voting together with Russia in terms of against condemning Russia for the invasion, illegal, brutal invasion of Ukraine. And but Israel was also in this group, and Poland has voted either against or boycotted Durban resolutions, and we've been always on the side of Israel in that regard. But I'm wondering what is the rationale? How would you look at that? How would you what are your thoughts on Israel voting together with Russia, North Korea, United States in support of Russian aggression on Ukraine? Thank you.
Would you like to come back straight away, or?
Sure, I think there's quite a bit there to. Yeah.
I mean, straightforwardly, I disagree with that vote profoundly, and I think that Ukraine and the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian nation has stood on the front line for democracy in Europe, but actually also in North America for 3 years now. And I think that in Poland you're more aware of that than we are in Britain and than we are in Canada. But I think that the defense of the democratic state is the most important thing anywhere at the moment. And I think that the Trumpist movement does not have any respect for the democratic state and does not understand why the democratic state exists. And I think that's also true of a certain portion of the left. And interestingly, the Trumpists and the far left are now saying precisely the same thing about Ukraine, which is a sort of general anti-war rhetoric. We don't like people being killed. And by the way, Ukraine wanting to join NATO was provocative and was really what started the war. And Corbyn and Trump are saying exactly the same thing as Putin at the moment, which is interesting. And I think the term populism is useful. And I think the smartest kids, right, from across the Middle East, across Africa, across Asia, from the rich families are very often sent to university in North America and Europe. And when they come to Goldsmiths, the first thing that we teach them is that the Enlightenment was of no value at all, and that the Enlightenment, in fact, was the reconstitution of the old oppression in a modern and more formidable form. And the reason for injustice is Enlightenment values. So, in other words, when people come to learn in Europe and America, we teach them that the democratic state is of no value. So how would it even be possible for the people who we educate to defend Ukraine or Poland or Europe? I don't think it is possible,
right,
because I don't think our students, and there's nothing about our students, I don't think any students really know how to defend the idea of the democratic state, because they think that it's actually a disgraceful and oppressive apparatus and we would be better off smashing it up. Now, that is a possible position, but if you want to smash the state, you have to understand that there's a risk there, right? That if you want to smash the state and build a new one, you have to understand the risk. And in my experience, people who want to smash the state have no conception of the risk. And as George Orwell said, they are people who play with fire, who have no understanding that fire is even hot.